Hi everyone, this is Mark Lieber with Pendulum Global, and I'm here with a facilitating letter writing video. This video is really at the core of what Pendulum Global does. And so as a mentor, it's definitely a good idea to watch this video maybe even a couple times, just to get a good foundation in what this mentorship and letter writing is really all about. In this video, we'll start by going into some of the theoretical background behind mentorships and really how and why mentorships can really make a difference in a child. And then after that, we'll go into some of the more practical side of things and talk about some topics of conversation and different ways to approach different problems. So before we get into some of the sort of theoretical background and some content ideas for your letters, I just wanted to go into some of the logistics sort of underlying how the Pen Pal program actually works. So as most of you probably know by now, Pendulum Global is based on the idea that mentors like you can make a real difference in the lives of vulnerable children around the world who we might not have been able to communicate with 10 or 20 years ago. The mentors are generally undergraduate students, graduate students, or professionals, either in the United States or elsewhere. And when appropriate, we try to match mentors with mentees based on similar interests, possibly their career goals, etc. And the mentees are generally identified as individuals who are vulnerable for some reason, and they've sort of been identified by our partner organizations as someone who would really benefit from having a mentor like you. So the way that, that this works, so we're all based, or most of us are based in the US, and so, we'll be writing our letters, scanning them, and then emailing them to our headquarters. And then from there, all the letters will be read and screened just to make sure that there's nothing, inappropriate in them. And then from there, so, some of us are in Southern California right now, and then from there they'll be sent either to Swaziland, which is, generally in this area, or to the Philippines as well, which is generally in this area. And then from there, they'll be retrieved from our partner organizations, and then they'll be printed and distributed to your mentees. And so this happens approximately once a month. Obviously, the timing isn't always perfect, but we try to get an average of about one letter per month to your mentee. And then after that, the mentee will have some time to read the letter, write a response, and then those will be sent back to us as well. So they'll be going back in this direction. And in this direction, we actually don't read the letters that are coming directly from your mentee, mostly just to sort of keep up the confidentiality of your relationship and just to make it as private as we possibly can. So on the way out, the letters will be vetted and screened, but on the way back, the letters that your mentees write will be completely confidential. All right, so now we're going to really get into the heart of this video. That's sort of going into some of the background research and sort of theory that's been done on mentoring and how mentoring can positively impact the development, particularly of a vulnerable child. So what you have in front of you right now is a model that was first proposed in a paper called A Model of Youth Mentoring by Jean Rhodes. It was actually in a book that was called A Handbook of Youth Mentoring by David Dubois. And if you have any interest in sort of reading any of the academic literature on mentoring, it's a pretty good book. It actually has quite a few articles, including one on e-mentoring that we'll talk about in just a second. But regardless, it's really one of the, what you see in front of you is one of the sort of foundational models for how mentoring can really impact the life of a child. So at the heart of it is really this mentoring relationship right here, and as in any relationship, it's based on mutuality, trust, and empathy, and things that we really encourage you to spend a lot of time really sort of building this foundation, because without it, it's really difficult to really branch off and do any sort of work in these other avenues. So in this model, there's sort of three ways in which a positive mentor can influence the growth and development of a mentee. And these are: one, social and emotional development; two is cognitive development; and then three is identity development. So just to sort of touch on each one of these briefly. So social and emotional development really has to do with modeling healthy coping strategies for your mentee, showing them how to deal with setbacks and disappointments appropriately, and how to really develop healthy and strong relationships, coping mechanisms, and be able to really sustain relationships with both peers and adults. So So that's sort of the social and emotional development, and in a way, your mentorship relationship is almost a model for that. So it's really important that that you uh, you maintain a healthy relationship because it's one that they might be using as a model for future relationships as well. So now we'll on to cognitive development. And cognitive development depends a little bit on the age of your mentee, but in general, social interactions have been shown even online to really facilitate cognitive processing. One of the most interesting things is something called self-monitoring, sort of the ability to see yourself from an outsider's perspective. So it's important to sort of talk to your mentee about how they view themselves, how they think others people view them, and also to sort of talk to them about some more traditional cognitive development, how school's going for them, how their grades are going, whether they like school, which classes they like, why they like certain classes, and to really just sort of help them identify, what their strengths are and perhaps what their weaknesses are, and to sort of work from there. And then finally, in terms of identity development, this is also going to depend slightly on the age of your mentee, but it has a lot to do with helping your mentee identify sort of where they see themselves in 5, 10, 20 years, how they identify or see themselves in their community, and sort of what their goals are, and what sort of steps they have to take to achieve those goals. So depending on how old they are, they'll likely be faced with lots of different questions about identity development. But in all cases, it's important to encourage them to keep, learning about themselves, figuring out what they enjoy and don't enjoy, and identifying steps to getting to where they want to be. So these are sort of the three main pathways outlined, at least in this model. And as you can see, they've come out with certain outcomes that they've measured in response to these, including grades, emotional well-being, being well-behaved. But I want to stress that a lot of these outcomes are really, difficult, if not impossible, to measure. So a lot of it just has more to do with encouraging self-confidence and just sort of some awareness um, of what they want in their lives. So, in addition to this sort of traditional mentoring model, I wanted to add one more thing on e-mentoring. So, e-mentoring is a relatively new area, particularly when it comes to research. And there really hasn't been too much done so far on sort of how mentorships online differ from mentorships in person, which is really the main difference. But there has been a few studies, and one of them was based on a paper by Miller and Griffiths called e-mentoring, and they talk a lot about digital heroes, which I'll just talk about very briefly. Digital Heroes was a project put together by People Magazine and AOL back in 2003. And what it did is it partnered in the United States vulnerable youth with prominent people in the community who could serve as mentors online. And they found a few things that are relevant to the Pendulum project. And one is they found that online students tended to be more disinhibited. And this isn't terribly surprising, but it really just sort of gets down to the point that that chances are that your mentee will open up to you, and it's important to not only be receptive to what they have to say, but to sort of to encourage them and to stress that they can trust you and that you are a friend, and that what they say to you is confidential. So, um, and that said, there have been other studies that have shown that it's also harder to gain trust online. So to take this with a grain of salt, but it's definitely important to stress to your mentee that you are a friend who can be trusted, and that you're more than just an email address. You're an actual person on the other side of the globe. In addition to that, there have also, or this paper specifically also discusses the importance of having frequent communications. I apologize for this asterisk, looks a little weird. Um, but not only the frequency of the communication, but also just managing expectations between the mentor and the mentee. So making sure that both people know approximately how often you'll be communicating. And as I mentioned before, we aim for usually having about one letter per month. So as long as both sides are sort of aware of the norms in terms of communication, then that's obviously a big step forward as well. And then, and finally, this paper, e-mentoring, also talks about the importance of self-disclosure from the mentor. So kind of as I just mentioned earlier, it's important to make sure that you come across as a real person as well, and not just an email address. And that you sort of talk about some of your dreams and wants and goals um, and challenges as well. And especially at the beginning when it might be difficult to break the ice, it's important to talk about yourself and to talk about your interests and things that you may or may not have in common with your mentee. So I think that's a pretty good background on some of the theory and research underlying our pen pal program. So I think what we're going to do now is move on and try to actually formulate some sample letters. But before I do that, I just want to actually touch on a couple requirements. Oh, sorry, my pen is not working very well. Okay. Anyway, just a couple of core requirements that sort of goes, sort of applies across all of the different letters that you're going to be sending to your mentee. So one is just to keep the child first. And what I mean by this is to really make sure that at the end of the day, sort of you reminding yourself that this is really about helping this child succeed, mature, and sort of grow throughout this process. Second is to make sure to keep the tone conversational. You know, this isn't a top-down sort of lecture. It's really should be between peers, and you should make sure to stress that you are someone who can be trusted. Also, just a reminder that not everything has to be deep or profound. So, doesn't need to be deep slash profound. You know, and that even though we do provide some, you know, guidelines and topics and that might be useful, um, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a deep conversation. It can be about just likes and dislikes, and even those things can really go a long way in terms of helping these children. And then lastly, these are just sort of the more logistical things, is to make sure to write legibly, right, with blue or black ink, and that's because we scan a lot of our letters. Oh, not blue, 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 black ink. So legibly, blue, black ink, and use simple English when you can, because for a lot of these um, mentees, English is not going to be their first language. So make sure that you use language that would be appropriate for someone, you know, as if you're talking to someone who was a young child. So legible, blue, black ink, simple English. So these are just some of the requirements that will go across all the different letters. So now we're going to go into some of the specifics for the first letter. All right, so now that we've gone over some of the theoretical background, I thought we would go into just some of the content of the letters that you'll be writing and some possible ideas for topics of conversation. So for the very first letter, and this is kind of going to be standard across all the different sites, is it going to be an introduction letter, which is really a time for you to really disclose information about yourself, um, provide some background on who you are, you know, if you're a student or if you're working, or just generally how old you are, what you do, what your likes and dislikes, and maybe a little bit of background also about the fact that you're a pen pal for this mentee through this program, and that you're a friend and that they can trust you. So just sort of build some of the foundation, um, the trust, empathy that we talked about earlier. So then for the next 2 to 5 letters, I encourage you to think about what we just talked about before in terms of those 3 pathways. So the social and emotional pathway, the cognitive pathway, and then the identity development one. And then just to give you some ideas for some of the letters, and again, these are just guidelines, these are just sort of recommendations, so by no means feel like you need to follow these as dogma. So Perhaps for the first letter, for social and emotional, you could start by talking about your likes and dislikes, um, and maybe ask your mentee if there's anything in particular that they like to do, any hobbies. Um, and then for cognitive, you can just start by asking what year in school they are, what their favorite subjects are in school, just to get a sense of sort of what their perspective is on education and their general experience so far, in the classroom setting. So favorite subject. Okay, and then for identity, you can start by sort of asking them about their family, and you can, if you feel comfortable, talk about your family as well. Maybe if you're married or have kids, or um, talk about your siblings or parents, and you can ask if they have any particular role models in their family. Um, just sort of get a sense of what their life is like at home. And then for I guess I'll put it over here, the second letter, some other ideas for social emotional, and again, these are just suggestions. You could ask about their friends and their support network, either at school or in their neighborhood, to get a sense of, if they're social and generally engaging in activities with people their own age. And then for cognitive, you could start by asking maybe if there's anything that's a challenge for them. Um, and this is a great opportunity for you to also maybe disclose some challenges that you've had and ways that you've overcome them or faced them. And this can be, challenges either in the classroom or maybe in other ways as well. But definitely starting off from the perspective of the classroom might be a good segue. And then for identity, this could be a good time to talk about career aspirations. And this is true for all of the programs, but especially for the Philippines one, where the mentors and mentees are matched based on career aspirations. So for them, maybe you'd even want that to be a part of the first letter. But this is a great opportunity for you to sort of see or ask where they see themselves in terms of in 5 or 10 years in terms of their career, what they've always wanted to do or want to be when they grow up. And you can talk about your experiences as well. And for a lot of these people, there might not be role models in the community for a particular job. So you might become a good resource for them in terms of identifying what the steps would be to sort of establish or do what they want to do in terms of their career. And then finally, for the third letter, for social and emotional, you could start by talking about if they, are part of any other communities, especially maybe religious or church communities. This is, I'm sure, going to be um, part of a lot of people's lives in terms of your mentees, and then also sports. Sports is always an international link, so you can always ask them if they play sports or watch sports, and then for cognitive, this might be a good time for you to sort of branch off of what you've identified so far um, in terms of their subjects that they either like or find challenging, and sort of encourage them to kind of stimulate their interests, whatever you've identified. Either maybe share websites with them, or you could maybe recommend a book, or you could both read a book together, not together, but independently at the same time, and try to keep your mentee sort of engaged in whatever you've identified that is interesting to them. And then for identity, um, you might want to ask about sort of how your mentee views his role in or her role in the community. And this could provide a good segue to the very end of the Pen Pal program, which is the community service project. So that might be a good time to segue sort of into that topic of conversation. So in addition to these three letters, and for some of you there might be more than these three, but these are just some ideas of threads that you might want to start that I'm sure will continue throughout the rest of the Pen Pal program. I also wanted to talk, though, about just some additional topics that might come up uh, throughout your letter writing. So the first is health-related topics. We bring this up partially that this is going to be across the board just because of sort of the immense impact that a lot of diseases and illnesses are going to have on the communities in which these people live. It could very well become a topic of conversation either with regard to their own health or to the health of people in their family. So just some general suggestions and this is also particularly true in terms of the Swaziland project where we do partner with an organization that serves HIV positive individuals. So, health-related topics could very well come up in that context as well. So, we generally don't recommend, asking specifically about if, if your mentee or somebody else, has a particular illness, and it's sort of a topic that we normally recommend letting the mentee bring up themselves. But it is also a very important topic of conversation, so we also don't want to shy away from it as either. So it's kind of something that you might want to bring it up in a more positive context, for example, by talking about nutrition and diet, the importance of sort of a balanced diet, and then this thing I'm going to call sort of healthcare maintenance. So you can just sort of you ask your mentee generally if they've ever been to the hospital before, if they've ever seen a doctor or a nurse or a clinical officer before, if they've ever been sick before, just to sort of open up some of those topics of conversation. Another one I want to talk about is just mental health, actually. So just to sort of have it in the back of your head for some of these mentees, because a lot of them are coming from pretty vulnerable backgrounds, and in some cases, they perhaps have lost family members or other loved ones, and so something just to keep in the back of your head that some of the mentees might be dealing with grief and loss and perhaps going through the grief cycle. So that's sort of not to end on that sad note, but so that's sort of what I just wanted to bring up in sort of health related, and then I also wanted to kind of just bring up that a lot of these mentees are going to be coming from pretty rural backgrounds. And so some of them might be, or just in general, a lot of these areas, agriculture is a big part of a lot of people's lives. And so if your mentees do come from sort of more of an agrarian or agricultural background, you might want to bring up sort of some topics about what their family grows, maybe how much it goes for, and maybe if there's a similar food here, you could talk about that. But it's definitely a topic of that's a big part of a lot of people's lives. And then another topic that frequently comes up is religion. And especially from mentees who come from more a rural background, religion will probably, or even in urban areas too, religion is going to probably play a pretty big role in a lot of the mentees' lives. So it's something that they might ask you about, and obviously feel free to disclose as much as much as you want about your own religious beliefs. But it's something that might come up, and we just encourage you to approach the conversation with an open mind and to just realize that a lot of people who come from these backgrounds are quite religious. And then lastly, I just wanted to say that if anything else comes up and you're just not sure exactly what to do or if you should tell someone, definitely feel free to contact us. Feel free to email us or send us a message on our website. So this sort of goes over at least the first few letters. And then as your relationship sort of progresses, obviously each one of these threads may become more or less important. But here's just some ideas of possible topics of conversation and ways to sort of approach all the different pathways that we were talking about earlier. And finally, for your last few correspondences with your mentee, you should begin brainstorming community service projects for your mentee to work on in his or her community. And in some places, such as Swaziland, this project will likely be set. I think right now they're doing a community garden, which is sort of organized by the partner organization that we work with. But in some other cases, it might be more independently developed, in which case you should be working with your mentee to come up with some ideas of projects and ways to possibly implement them in their community. And so that concludes the webinar training video on letter writing for Pendulum Global. As I mentioned before, most of what I talked about in the video is really just a guideline, so definitely feel free to talk about topics that were not talked specifically in this short video, and think every now and then about some of the things that we discussed in terms of the model. We hope that you have a great time through this pen pal program. So happy mentoring.